Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyotirgamaya Mrityormam Amrita Gamaya Avir Ahavir Maedhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukha Tena Maham Paha Inityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Well, they have some new lights here, so they seem to be pretty bright. My subject this morning is, I'm going to change my title. My subject this morning is, who are the gods? And we're going to be talking about those celestial beings who live in higher worlds, who are many in number, no one of which is that no one of the gods is omnipotent, omniscient, or omnipresent. That is, no one of the gods has the power of God, or of Ishvara, or of Brahman, the God of Vedanta, who is all-pervading, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent Lord of the universe. So they're secondary to God. But they're certainly superior to us earthlings. That is, they have more power, they are longer lived, and we may say, many examples, they seem to be more spiritual. Now, this is a weird subject, because we in America, we don't worship the gods, right? So let's try to wrap our brain around what they're talking about. And, well, we know something about the gods. We know something about the Roman gods. I mean, just think about astronomy. You think about Mercury. What are the planets? All of the planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, which is Gaia, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. These are all the names of Roman gods. So the names, at least, are still with us today. And certainly, as students of English, you know very well how much in common parlance, the number of allusions to Greek mythology, and every school boy knows the names of the Greek gods: Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, Apollo, and Dionysius. The Hindu gods, which is kind of our framework this morning, are called Devas. And it would be good maybe for us to, when we're talking about this subject and many others in the Vedanta philosophy, wisdom of the East, to incorporate into our vocabulary some of these words which help us to be more discriminating in our use. So we're going to call these Indian gods the Devas. Deva literally means a shining one. And the Devas were those beings who were addressed by the Vedic hymns. The Vedas, as you know, are the oldest religious scriptures in the world. And there in the most ancient of times, we have hymns that are addressed to these Devas, these otherworldly beings. The word Deva is kind of interesting to us from an etymological point of view, from the Sanskrit word div. Well, we get Deva, we know about the Latin Deus. Spanish we're well acquainted with, Dios, same root. As you know, Sanskrit, of course, is the elder sister of all of those Latin, Greek, Germanic. So there are root words which we hold in common. The Hindus used to worship the dawn, the Dios Pitar, which comes to us in our word. Dios Pitar literally means our Father who art in heaven. The Sanskrit word Deva, Deus, became, in Greek, became Zeus. Some of these words, the letter, you change the letters, they become Zeus. In Germanic, it became the word that we know as Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. Tuz was a Germanic god, which came from the Sanskrit word div. So there are these Vedic gods. For example, there is the Lord of the sun god, Surya Deva. There's the god of the moon, Soma. There's Vayu, the lord of the wind. And Agni, the lord of the fire, Varuna, the lord of the ruler of all the great waters of the oceans. And in ancient times, householders used to worship the gods. They had a ceremony, still practiced today. It's called the Pancha Yagya ceremony, where one of the items, in the process, they worship different, worship the creation in all of its different manifestations, adhyatmika, adhibhautika, adhidaivika. And one of the recipients of the offerings were the gods. And the idea was, in ancient times, that the gods are all powerful, and if we offer them food and incense, and that sweet smell of the incense goes up into the heavens, the gods are very pleased with those offerings, and therefore they will benefit us. They will send rain and sunshine, and we'll prosper on the earth, and they will prosper in heaven, and everyone will be happy. It'll be a kind of a cosmic ecology. And, well, let me give you an example of one of these gods. Here's an example. Let's take, for example, Surya Deva, the god of the sun. Now, you have to admit, when you look up in the sky at the sun, of course, you can't really look at the sun, can you? Because it's too powerful. It's too great. Your eyes will be totally blind and dazzled. So you can't really even look at the sun. And what more of an idea of a divine being could we imagine than the sun, which is the source of all of our light, of our heat, of our energy, in fact, of our life here on the earth. So if we were going to be to worship something, I mean, that would be a pretty good choice, to worship the sun. Now, in ancient times, the Lord of the Surya Deva, we're told in the stories of mythology, the sun, the chariot rises in the morning, he's driving his horses, comes across the sky, wheels of the spokes of the chariot are turning, they have 7 spokes, the 7 rays of the sun, the light of the spectrum of the colors. He passes through the heavens. And is that possible? You can think, well, here, let me give you some reasoning as to why is that. That's not just a story. So if let's say, for example, you look up at it's a hot day, there's a fan that's turning a ceiling fan. And you see that fan is turning, and you say, well, why is it turning? Well, you know why it's turning, because it's driven by electricity. Now, how do you know have you ever seen electricity? Never seen it. But somehow you're totally confident that it is. You learned how the fan works, and you'd be right. That's a scientific truth. And so even though it's invisible, you have a very good reason for believing that that's why it's working. Let's take, for example, another person, a human person. You look at a human person, another body. That body, as you know, from physics and chemistry, really, if we were to analyze all the components of that physical body, we know that it just is all matter and energy. It's all composed of the elements. Maybe that body is composed of the same elements as the table. And so we could say, well, what is it that makes a difference between a person and a table? Well, we say, well, it's obvious. The person is alive. What does it mean to be alive? Well, that's a more difficult question, is what is life? Yoga psychologists will explain to us that what is life, what it means to be alive, is that we have within us a life force. We have within us a subtle body, which when our gross body dies, that material will just be left behind. The subtle body, however, will remain. And the subtle body has all its powers. It doesn't have eyes and ears, physical eyes and ears, organs, but it does have the power to see and the power to hear. And all that, continue on. That is, life continues. There's life after life. And if we were to imagine one of those powers, I were to see my eyes. My eyes can see, the eyeballs are seeing. That's not really seeing. The seeing is done by the power within our own mind. In Sanskrit, it's called yoga psychology. Of course, maybe they'd say it's in the brain. Or yoga psychology say, no, it's in the mind. That's an indriya. It's a power. That's a power that you have to see. Now, what if you have problems seeing? What if you have maybe some impairment of your vision? In India, what they would do is, if that's the case, they would pray to Surya Deva, the Lord of the Sun, because after all, why is it that we can see everything? Because of the sun. Sun is what enables us to see anything. Let's look at that power. You see the idea that behind this power, these are kind of principles. one principle that we can invoke is this: behind every power of an individual, there must be a larger source of power. Otherwise, say you were stopped by a policeman, and a policeman is going to give you a ticket, and you may say, do you question the power of that policeman to write you a traffic ticket? After all, he's just another guy like yourself. No, you know that he's not. Because why? Because he has power. That is, the power is not just of himself. It's a power behind the policeman that you respect, the authority that you fear. That is the whole law and the Justice Department. All that stands behind. That's what gives the power. The power has a source. There is a larger power. There is a universal power. And, as we know, power is a position of ascendancy. That is, when we talk about power, we have to, it entails the idea of a person who has the power. Power doesn't just float around. Power is not energy. Power is power. Someone has the power. Who has the power? Well, maybe we could say the Justice Department, maybe the Attorney General has the power. Similarly, it is in the universe. Every microcosm mirrors the microcosm, mirrors the macrocosm. This is the principle. That for every individual, whatever is in the individual is also in the universal. Whatever is in the microcosm, in the collectivity, the individual and the collective. Therefore, just as we have a power of seeing, there is a universal power of seeing. That power is a devata. It's called Surya Deva. He's the presiding deity of sight and of the power to see. Let's go a little bit more here about the we're not talking about soul, God, and religion this morning. We're just kind of trying to wrap our brains around an interesting concept, which really is, as we go deeper into it, we'll see it really is integral to fundamental teachings of higher philosophy. But let's just dwell on this for a little while, this idea that there are gods. There are gods. Let's compare. I don't even know if I'm going to get through any of this today. But I'm not going to rush. So when we get to the time, I just stop. And but let's start by comparing this. Here's our project, is to try to understand who are these Devas. And we're going to call them Devas and compare them with our ordinary understanding of gods, which are the Greek gods. That's probably the ones who are the most familiar to us. Now, you don't have to be a deep student of Greek mythology just to know the basics. That is, that there is a pantheon of superhuman, larger than life people, beings. They're flesh and blood beings, but they're larger than life. Maybe you can imagine that they're 20 feet high. And they live on this earth, albeit on Mount Olympus. And there are many gods, and they have the powers. They rule over the powers of nature. Many of them are personified, the powers of nature, and rule over nature. They have supernatural powers. And not only that, you can be an ordinary person, you can never become a god. Because gods are kind of like the British aristocracy. See, if you're in the nobility of the British aristocracy, then you belong to you're part of the British peerage. That means you're part of a class of beings who are superior to ordinary commoners. And it doesn't matter if you are a commoner, it doesn't matter how much wealth and money and intelligence and power and achievement you have. It doesn't even matter if you are knighted by the king or the queen. That doesn't count. You still don't make it up into the hierarchy of the peerage. That is, that's hereditary nobility. And they're different from ordinary people. Why? Because they've got blue blood. People like you and I, we have red blood. So whatever we do, and however bad they are, doesn't matter. They belong to a different class of beings. Similarly, this with the Greek gods. They belong to a different class of beings. And they ruled this world and decided men's fate. The Indian Devas are not like this. For one thing, the Greeks were polytheists. The Hindus were never polytheists. For another thing, the Indian Devas are not physical flesh and blood beings. They are beings. They are beings that have subtle and causal bodies. They don't have physical bodies, and they don't live in the physical world. And even though in Indian mythology they speak of some place like Mount Kailash, the abode of Shiva, which is a real mountain you can find on a map, in the stories they're not referring to that. You're not going to see anything on the top of that physical mountain, because they're referring to a subtle realm. And so these gods are, not only that, the Devas do not have supernatural powers. They have siddhis. That means they have powers. They have amazing powers, but they're not supernatural. They're not magical. These are not magical beings. And they are the Devas. So we can start, at least we're trying to kind of zero in. These Devas are not like the Greek gods. They're pretty radically different from our conception of the Greek gods. Now, if you read the Greek philosopher Plato, for example, he talks a lot about the gods. And Plato does a lot of in his dialogues, many references to the gods and the stories about the gods. And he has a lot of disparaging things to say about the Greek gods, how they misbehave, and all of the things which they have done which are not good, and whether those stories are true or they're not true. And should we be telling these stories to our children? And all of that. And in fact, he coined a word called mythology. Mythology to refer to all of those stories about the gods which were too outrageous to believe. Stuff that we just didn't seem possible. Fiction. Fictional stories. He called them mythology. But Plato and Socrates never questioned the existence of the gods. Stories, yeah. Some of the stories we can question. Some of the stories we can assign to mythology. They don't make any sense. But to question the existence of the gods, he never did that. And so the Devas maybe are something like that. That is some story or another aspect of some part of a story we may question and assign to mythology, but we don't question the existence of the gods. And some people say that if you read question, the title is "Who are the gods?" Some people say that these stories, or these that we read about these gods, are psychological in nature. And if you go to USC, you go back in the library, and back in the stacks there, you'd be stunned and amazed to see the complete works of two people. One is Mahatma Gandhi, like 25 volumes, big fat volumes, and the other one is Dr. Carl Jung, maybe 30 volumes, big fat volumes. Nobody's ever going to read all this. One of them is entitled "The Psychological Foundation for a Belief in Spirits." We did Jungian analysis. Jung's analysis become very popular today. A kind of a Jungian understanding, a conception of what is a god. Carl Jung, according to Carl Jung, in Jungian psychology, the gods are archetypes in a collective unconscious. And as a Jungian archetype is what in Sanskrit maybe we would call a kind of some samskara. That is to say, it's an impression, it's a pattern. It's a kind of an imprint or a pattern that finds expression. That is, we all share as participate in the universal unconscious according to Jungian psychology. And that these archetypes naturally tend to express themselves in our dreams, in our spontaneous artwork, and in folk tales and folk stories, right? That's how do we explain these stories and these dreams? They all go back to the same archetypes. Yeah, the Greek gods. That's their imprints in the collective unconscious. Maybe some of you remember a book that was very popular many years ago, maybe 20 years ago now, a book by Jean Bolin, who was a Jungian psychologist. Title of the book was "Gods in Every Man." Now that's a title that's kind of interesting to students of Vedanta, because hey, that sounds like what we teach, seeing God in everything. But this is a radically different thesis. Her thesis is that within every one of us, that each one of us has, as an individual, we have our own personal archetype, which is one of the Greek gods. And that if we are to be healthy and happy and holistic, that we want to integrate that unconscious archetype with our conscious mind and get in alignment with that God within who is trying to express himself or herself within us. This is the psychological interpretation of the idea of the gods. The Indian Devas are not like this. The Devas are not psychological archetypes. So we see then that the Devas are not, that is, I'm assuming all of you are students of comparative religion, all of you are well read in Indian philosophy, wisdom of the East. You know the stories I'm talking about of the gods. And we've seen, though, that these Devas are not physical beings. They're not what we would call supernatural beings. You see, in Vedanta, we don't like that word, supernatural. Swami Vivekananda preferred the word superconscious. Supernatural, there is nothing that's supernatural, except for Brahman, but everything that we know. So these devas are not physical beings. They're not supernatural. They don't have supernatural powers. They're not mythological stories, folk tales, fairy tales. And they're not. This is not psychology we're talking about. That is, these devas are not in your head. In fact, the ancient Hindus, that is, the students of the Vedanta philosophy, make a very strong claim, about these gods, and that is that they are real people. Now you see if you can integrate that into the factory of your brain. This is what we're trying to figure out. That these are independent, autonomous, free will agents who have bodies, albeit subtle bodies, who have minds like ourselves, thinking, feeling, willing, conscious agents of action. And that there they are. Now, who are these gods? Let's ask that question. In ancient times, in the Upanishads, we read there in Chandogya Upanishad, the Lord of the gods, that is, his name was Indra. Indra and Virochana, the Lord of the demons, approached Prajapati. Prajapati is the name of Aishwanara. That means the god, the Lord that rules the waking state of our awareness. They approached Prajapati, and there they were spiritual spirits. They wanted to know the question about the self, the Atman. What is the true nature? How can I know what is my true nature? What is myself? And Prajapati, the Lord, answered them and says, yes, well, you answered that question. Well, you go over there and look into that lake of water. And it was a particularly calm, quiet day. The water of the lake was all placid and clear, like glassy, like a mirror. And they walked over there and they looked in there in the mirror, and Virochana, the Lord of the gods, he looked down, and who did he see there in the lake? There he saw his own fine self. He smiled, and the reflection smiled, and he thought, oh, this is what he means by the self. He means me. Yeah, now I understand. He means just me, just myself. And he got up, and he was fully satisfied with the answer, and he returned to his world. Meanwhile, Indra, he did the same. He looked in the water, said, oh, yes, looks like myself. Yes, he got up and he walked off, and then he started thinking a little bit, wait a minute. All I saw was a reflection of my face, that is my body. The body, that couldn't be the answer of my true self. Then he went back to Prajapati, and Prajapati again gave him the same instructions. Go and look in the water, which he did again, and then his wheels started turning. He said, you can read the story for yourself, how he began to go through the progression of understanding his deeper and deeper and deeper self, came to realize his true nature. Now it's said that the children of Indra are the gods, and the children of Virochana, they are the demons. And where do we fit in? Well, we're humankind. We fit in somewhere. When we die, you see, all of us, when we read there in the Bhagavad, when we die, as you know very well, when we when you die, your subtle body, you leave the body. And we've discussed this in detail on other occasions. And what happens? You don't just, you find yourself, well, what happens? You don't just go into oblivion. Not at all. It's kind of like when you fall asleep at night. You fall asleep. It's not long before there you find yourself in a dream world. Similarly it is in a life after life. You soon find yourself in a world with a body. Now this world is not a dream world, but I'm saying it's like a dream world. Underline the word like. In what sense? Well, in the sense that when we look around, we see we're not alone. That there are trees, and there are buildings, and there's all places around us. There's people, places, and things. And there are many other people all around us. And there are other people with other bodies. And everything seems to be very much the same as it was. Similarly, it is in the afterworld. Let's take, for example, we're talking now about, let's talk about the heavens, the heavenly worlds, higher worlds. You go to a higher world according to your karma. Now, you don't have to go there, according to the great law of karma, but the likelihood is maybe that if you have merits and demerits and the universe requires a balancing of the books, then you may go to one of these higher worlds. You will wake up in the world. There you will find yourself surrounded by many beings. It makes sense. You see, when you die, everybody, all these people die, and hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of people die. And on the earth there's 7 billion people, but maybe there's another 50 billion people who died. Where are they? Where are all these people? I mean, you say, well, maybe you shouldn't use the word people, because they're subtle bodies, but they're still beings in subtle bodies, and they have a mind and a heart and a soul, and there they are. They occupy space. They're in space-time and causation. They have to occupy some space. That's just logic. It's not a chaos. It's not just a mad whirling whirlpool of energy somewhere. No, this world is not a chaos. It is a cosmos. There is law. That's why we live in this world. This world is a world of law. There's things happen, everything is in order. Similarly it is in other worlds. Things are in order. And we will soon find that in that world, we will find that there are shining beings like ourselves. We are shining beings. That is, we're Devas. Now, there are different classes of Devas. There are what are called Pitris, who are ordinary people. And then there are Pitri Devas, who are special. See, even in the afterworld, there's going to be a hierarchy of prominence, just as there is in this world. There are some people who are more prominent, who have more political power. There's a whole hierarchy of power. Similarly, there's a whole hierarchy of mental and intellectual and cultural powers. There's worlds of great musicians, of the Gandharvas and the Apsaras. And there's men and there's women. Gandharvas are married to the Apsaras. That is, there's divine musicians and divine celestial dancers. And so those beings are all there. And so we see here that there is this gross world, and there's the sun. There's a fundamental, we're not going to discuss that this morning, but we have a presumption here that I look here at the clock because I never go over time. There is a presupposition here, is philosophy, that is, there is a there's a gross world, and there's a subtle world, and there is a causal world. And in these heavenly worlds, another thing about these devas is that they don't make new karma. In the heavenly world, you see, let's talk about this. There are 14 worlds. Now I'll just give you the arbitrary number, depending on which scriptural text that we're going to be reading. There are different numbers. Okay, there's 7 worlds above and there are 7 below. Let's talk about the 7 above. Now, where are these worlds, we could say? These worlds are, we look up in the sky. Are they like up in the sky? Because by subtle, we're not talking here about molecules and atoms. We're talking here about, so it's not like talking about levels of atmosphere. Like we have the atmosphere here, and then we have the atmosphere, the troposphere, and the stratosphere, and the ionosphere, and we can imagine it gets subtler and subtler. See, that's our use of the word subtle. They're not using the word subtle in that sense. It's not subtle in the sense that there's a sweet perfume in the room. We can't touch it, we can't measure it, but we can just it's barely aware of it. No, see, that's subtle. We'd say it's subtle, but that's not subtle in the sense that they're using it. They're using it as subtle in the sense of a kind of a moral plane. That is, just as we think of this earth, if this earth is the place is in the middle, that we have fair, this is like fair, then you have bad, worse, worst, then you have good, better, best. Like that, you can have a whole hierarchy. It's a kind of a qualitative hierarchy of beings. And it's graded according to karma. And that as we go into these higher worlds, that generally the 3 lower worlds, that is of 7 higher, this is the earth, Bhur, Bhuva, Swar, Mahar, Janas, Tapasatib, the 3 lower worlds, are worlds of intense enjoyment and pleasure. That is reward for your good karma, your good deeds. In the sense that worldly good deeds, that is, deeds done with a selfish motive, but good deeds done with that motive to go to a heavenly world. But then there are also the higher of the 7 worlds, who are more spiritual worlds. That is, people who've earned great spiritual merit and who live in states of meditation. It's higher, they're siddhas. And they live in higher states of meditation. But they don't make karma. Why? Because the enjoyment, or of course you just reverse the picture and you get the idea of the underworlds. We don't want to call them hells because that would be a misnomer, because the hells are different, but these are more and more gross worlds, and there the pain is more intense. The suffering is more intense. In the higher worlds, like that, you can see there's a kind of a mirror image. And so, but they don't make karma. Why? Because they're overwhelmed by the fruits of their karma, and by pleasure and pain, or by their own spiritual absorption. The only place that you can make karma is right here on the earth, in the karma bhumi. This is the realm, the realm of man. And you may say, well, that sounds like it's kind of anthropocentric. Well, yeah, this is anthropocentrism, but it is in a particular sense. Doesn't really mean this planet Earth, and it doesn't really mean human beings in the sense of people who have a DNA of a carbon-based life form. It may not mean that. That is, you may be a Klingon or a Romulan or something living on another planet. You're still a self-conscious being. You are still a person. That's what they mean. That's all we know. Persons are men. That's all we know. So therefore we limit our vocabulary to that. But wherever we find self-conscious persons, then we would include where they would be included, those beings. So these are the worlds in which these beings live. There's a hierarchy of power. Some of them have powers over the natural world. Some of them have intersubjective powers over what we call culture and language. And so that we could ask our project this morning is just kind of one of disambiguation. That is, I'm not giving you, there's a lot of question marks, no doubt, in your mind still. That's good. That's kind of our homework. That's something that we can contemplate. We can ask ourselves, maybe our last question is, where are the gods? I mean, what happened to them? What happened to the gods? We don't pick up religious books. Today, we read about took a book, say, at least on Indian philosophy. We don't hear about the worship of the gods. Remember, in ancient times, the gods were worshipped as part of the cosmic ecology. What happened? Well, if you read there you can read there in the complete works of Swami Vedarupananda on the subject of the evolution of the conception of God. It's a great, vast subject. How as humankind, our idea of God. What is God? God is in the infinite. How our ideas of the infinite gradually grew from the earliest times, the worship of stones and the trees, to semi-tangible, tangible things, to the worship of higher otherworldly beings who are called the Devas, and it goes from polytheism to henotheism to monotheism to monism to Advaita, Vedanta, so a whole progression. We're somewhere in the middle here. We were talking about the many, we're at the stage here, the many gods. That is, in the popular conception, in ancient times, even in the ancient Rig Veda, there is talk there of the one. Well, we can ask what happened to these gods? Well, there's the higher conception of God emerged. That is, that all these gods, that each one was limited, that they were persons who were limited in their powers, that there must be a being who is not limited in his presence, in his power, in his knowledge, in his wisdom, in his goodness. That is, there must be one. The many are assimilated into the one. The many gods, in the course of human evolution, of human psychology, and we're talking here really, well, they become one, and the many at one point there, that's kind of the next stage. That is, that there is a supreme Lord. There is one God who is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, who rules all the others. That all of the other gods become his ministers. They become his servants. They become his functionaries. And thus they are kind of the great gods of the Vedic gods. That is, the Lord of the Thunder, Indra, the Lord of the Thunder, and the lightning has been decommissioned now. And we look deeper into the background, and we see that no, there's a nut behind him. There is a higher power. There is a greater power. That's the supreme Lord of the universe. That is in our conception here of one supreme personal God. That's the stage we're stopping at this morning. One supreme person who rules all of the other supreme high persons, but who are not the supreme person. And so there is the hierarchy. And so there the gods were kind of relegated to a secondary position. They were beginning to be seen as mere functionaries or instruments of the supreme person. But they didn't go away. They're still there. They're still doing their job. It's just that we've reconceptualized the hierarchy of power. We've kind of reevaluated who's in charge. We've kind of shifted our attention to who's in charge, and therefore when we pray, and you can still hear today, if you come and hear a worship service, you'll still hear the names of these Vedic gods mentioned, but when those names are mentioned, they're not the worshiper is not directing their attention. They're directing their attention to the supreme person, and has in mind that all those names are seen as subsidiary aspects, functions of that supreme person, and it's the supreme person who they worship. That's God with a capital G. And so the Vedic gods, what happened to them? That is, what happened to the autonomous, individual, separate persons who are the Devas? Well, they've lost their autonomy. They've lost their power has shifted. That is, our conception of their power has shifted, but they're still doing the same job. It's just now we recognize that they're not really in charge, that there are people higher ups who are in charge. They're greater, and when we worship the power behind the gods, because we recognize they have a higher power. And so we can kind of bypass them and go directly to the higher power. But according to the traditional, I'm giving you the old-fashioned, you see if you believe it, the old-fashioned, traditional, orthodox Indian teaching. The gods are still there. Surya Deva is still, you look up in the sky, don't think that is a ball of hydrogen, what is it called, a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear reaction going on in the sky that's studied by astrophysics. That's a Devata. Surya Deva is still alive and well. He is doing his job. But we know that he himself is ruled by a higher power. That it is to that higher power that we pray. It's to that higher power that when we do our worship, we look to that being, even though we evoke the names. But we ought not to forget that the gods are still there. And maybe they feel lonely. Maybe we need a revival of paganism. And so what is our relationship as students of Vedanta to the gods? Well, at least we can say that we acknowledge their existence. And we salute them. And we respect them. And we treat them with dignity. But we remember too that they are men like ourselves. All the gods, even the creator of this world, Brahma, is a person like you and me. Brahma was a person. He lived on the earth. He did spiritual practice. That's why he rose to that high level of the creator of the world. And we too can do the same. We can, all the gods, however high they are in the highest worlds, they have still to return to the earth to continue doing spiritual practice. And this is our understanding of the gods. Om Dyo Shantihi Antariksham Shantihi Prithivi Shantihi Apa Shantihi Oshadaya Shantihi Vanaspataya Shantihi Vishwe Deva Shantihi Brahma Shantihi Saravam Shantihi Shantireva Shantihi Same Shantiredhi Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om. Peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal, universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om. Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.